I want to tell you something personal, something I don't usually talk about in lectures or papers or interviews. I want to tell you about the day I stopped being afraid of death. I was 63 years old. I had been a physicist for 4 decades. I had thought about black holes, about the nature of space and time, about the quantum structure of reality. I had written equations describing the information content of the universe, and yet, like everyone else, I carried with me a quiet, persistent fear of my own ending, not constantly, not obsessively, but it was there, a shadow at the edge of consciousness, the knowledge that one day all of this would stop. Then one afternoon, sitting in my office at Stanford, staring out the window at nothing in particular, something shifted. I had been thinking about entropy, about the arrow of time, about how information behaves in the universe, and suddenly, without warning, the fear was gone, not suppressed, not rationalized away, just gone, replaced by something I can only describe as understanding, not a mystical experience, not a religious revelation, just a quiet recognition that death is not what I had thought it was. Let me try to explain what I mean by that. Let me take you through the same journey I took, through the physics that changed how I see my own mortality. I'm not going to tell you that physics proves there's an afterlife. It doesn't. I'm not going to tell you that consciousness survives death. I don't know if it does. What I'm going to tell you is what physics actually says about death, what it doesn't say, and why understanding the difference gave me peace. Let's start with what most people think death is. Most people think death is the end, the cessation of existence. One moment you're here, the next moment you're not. Your thoughts stop, your experiences stop, you stop. And then there's nothing. Not darkness, because darkness is something you experience. Not sleep, because sleep has a quality to it. Just nothing. The absence of everything, including the absence of anyone to notice the absence. This is terrifying if you think about it too long. The complete annihilation of everything you are. Every memory, every feeling, every thought, every dream. Gone. As if you never existed at all, except for the fading traces you leave behind in other people's memories, which will also eventually be gone. I carried this picture of death for most of my life. I assumed it was what physics told us. After all, physics is materialist, isn't it? Consciousness is just brain activity. When the brain stops, consciousness stops. End of story. This seemed like the scientific view, the rational view, the view that takes the universe seriously, rather than indulging in wishful thinking about souls and afterlives. But here's what I eventually realized. This picture of death, the complete annihilation view, is not actually what physics says. It's a philosophical interpretation layered on top of physics. And when you look carefully at what physics actually tells us, the picture becomes much stranger, much more interesting, and in some ways much less frightening. Let me start with the most basic physics of death, thermodynamics, the science of energy and entropy. When you die, what happens to your body? It decays. The complex molecular structures that make you, the proteins, the DNA, the neural connections, they break down. They disintegrate into simpler components. Eventually, your atoms disperse into the environment. Some become part of the soil, some become part of plants, some become part of other animals, some drift into the atmosphere and eventually into space. This is entropy at work, the second law of thermodynamics. Systems tend toward disorder. The exquisitely organized structure of a living human being is thermodynamically improbable. Maintaining it requires constant energy input. When that input stops, when you stop eating, breathing, metabolizing, the structure falls apart. Entropy wins. But here's what's interesting. The first law of thermodynamics says that energy is conserved. Nothing is created, nothing is destroyed. The energy that animates your body right now, the energy stored in your chemical bonds, the energy flowing through your neurons, that energy doesn't disappear when you die. It transforms, it disperses, but it continues to exist. The same is true of matter. Your atoms don't vanish. They were forged in stars billions of years ago. They've been part of countless other structures before they became part of you, and after you die, They'll become part of countless other structures. The carbon in your bones might end up in a tree, or a fish, or another human being, or drift through the cosmos for billions of years, until the heat death of the universe. There's something almost comforting about this, if you let yourself feel it. You are not separate from the universe. You are a temporary pattern in the universe, a wave that rises, crests, and returns to the ocean. The wave doesn't cease to exist when it crashes on the shore. It becomes the ocean again. It was always the ocean. But I know what you're thinking. So what? So my atoms continue. So my energy disperses. That's not me. I'm not my atoms. I'm the pattern, the organization, the experience. And that's what ends when I die. You're right. And this is where the physics gets more interesting. One of the deepest principles in physics, something we've come to understand only in the last few decades, is that information is fundamental. Information cannot be destroyed. This isn't a metaphor. It's a mathematical fact about how the universe works at the quantum level. The technical term is unitarity. Quantum mechanics is unitary, which means that the evolution of a quantum system preserves information. You can scramble information, you can spread it out, you can make it practically impossible to retrieve, but you cannot destroy it. The information that describes the quantum state of a system is always there, encoded somewhere in the universe. This principle was at the heart of one of the biggest debates in physics in the last 50 years, the black hole information paradox. When something falls into a black hole, it seems to disappear. The black hole eventually evaporates through Hawking radiation. But Hawking's original calculations suggested that this radiation was thermal, random, carrying no information about what fell in. If that were true, information would be destroyed. The laws of physics would be violated. I spent years working on this problem, and what we eventually concluded, what Stephen Hawking himself eventually accepted, is that information is not destroyed. It's encoded in the Hawking radiation in an incredibly subtle way. The information is scrambled beyond any practical hope of retrieval, but it's there. The universe keeps its records. Now, what does this have to do with death? Your brain contains information, enormous amounts of information. Your memories, your personality, your patterns of thought, your sense of self. All of this is encoded in the physical structure of your neurons, in the strengths of synaptic connections, in the patterns of electrical activity. When you die, when your brain decays, what happens to that information? According to the physics I've described, it cannot be destroyed. It must go somewhere. It gets scrambled, dispersed, and coded in the correlations between the particles that made up your brain as they spread throughout the environment. The information that was you doesn't vanish. It becomes part of the information content of the universe. But here's where I need to be honest with you. Information preservation is not the same as experience preservation. The information that described your brain states might continue to exist in some scrambled form, but that doesn't mean you continue to experience anything. A book that's been burned still has its information encoded in the smoke and ash and radiation, in principle. But the book is no longer readable. The story is no longer accessible. So information preservation alone doesn't give us immortality. It doesn't even give us continuation of experience. What it gives us is something subtler. The recognition that the boundary between you and the universe is not as sharp as you might think. The information that is you is not fundamentally different from the information that is everything else. You're not a separate thing that gets annihilated. You're a pattern in a continuous fabric. This is where my understanding of death really changed. This is where the fear dissolved. According to Einstein's theory of relativity, time is not what we think it is. We experience time as a flow, a river, carrying us from past to future. The past is gone. The future hasn't happened yet. Only the present is real. But relativity tells us this is an illusion. A very convincing illusion, deeply built into how our brains work. But an illusion nonetheless. In relativity, space and time are unified into a single four-dimensional structure called spacetime. And in spacetime there is no universal present. There is no moment of now that is the same for everyone. Different observers, moving at different speeds, will disagree about what events are simultaneous. What's present for you might be past for someone else and future for a third person. Einstein took this very seriously. When his lifelong friend Michel Besso died, Einstein wrote to Besso's family. He said, "Now he has departed from this strange world a little ahead of me. That means nothing." People like us who believe in physics know that the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. Einstein wasn't being poetic. He was being precise. In the physics he helped create, all of spacetime exists. The past isn't gone. The future isn't unreal. They're just regions of spacetime that we don't have access to from our current location. But they exist just as much as the present exists. This is sometimes called the block universe. The universe is a four-dimensional block, with time as one of the dimensions. Your life is a world line through this block, a path from birth to death. And that world line doesn't disappear when you reach the end of it. It's still there. It was always there. It will always be there. Think about what this means for death. In the block universe, your death is an event at a particular location in space-time. It's where your world line ends. But the rest of your world line, all the moments of your life, they still exist. They're still real. They're just located elsewhere in space-time, in what we call the past. You are not annihilated at death. You are eternal, in the sense that your existence is a permanent feature of the space-time structure. The moments of your life don't cease to be. They're always there, frozen in the block, as real as any other part of the universe. Now I know this might sound like empty comfort. Yes, my past exists, but I can't experience it again. I'm stuck moving forward through time, toward the end of my world line, and then, what? The block universe doesn't say anything about what happens to experience. It doesn't say I'll re-experience my life. It just says the events of my life are permanent features of reality. But here's what shifted for me. I stopped thinking of death as annihilation. I started thinking of it as a boundary, the edge of a shape. My life is a shape in space-time, and death is where that shape ends. But the shape itself is real. It exists. It doesn't need to continue forever to be real. A painting doesn't need to be infinite to be beautiful. A symphony doesn't need to play forever to be meaningful. They have boundaries, they have endings, and the endings are part of what makes them what they are. This is where physics reaches its limits. This is where I have to be most honest with you about what we don't know. Consciousness is the hard problem. We don't understand it. We don't understand how physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience. We don't understand why there is something it is like to be you rather than nothing at all. We have no good theory of consciousness that connects it to physics in a satisfying way. Some people think consciousness emerges from complexity. Get enough neurons connected in the right way and consciousness appears. But this doesn't explain anything. It just restates the mystery. Why would complexity produce experience? What is it about information processing that creates an inner life? Others think consciousness is fundamental. Not something that emerges from matter, but something that exists alongside matter, or perhaps underneath it. Panpsychism, some call it. The idea that consciousness is woven into the fabric of reality at the deepest level. In this view, your brain doesn't create consciousness. It shapes it, focuses it, gives it a particular form, but the raw capacity for experience is everywhere. I don't know which view is correct. Nobody does. This is genuinely unsolved. The greatest mystery in science, some say, and it bears directly on the question of death. If consciousness emerges from brain activity, then when brain activity stops, consciousness stops. End of experience. The materialist view. Simple, clean, and terrifying if you think about it. But if consciousness is fundamental, if it's not created by brains but only filtered or shaped by them, then the death of the brain might not be the end of consciousness. It might be a transformation, a return to some more basic form of awareness, or a dispersal, or something we can't even imagine. I want to be clear. I'm not advocating for the second view. I don't know if it's true. The evidence for it is thin and contested, but I'm also not advocating for the first view. We don't understand consciousness well enough to be confident about what happens to it at death. What I'm saying is that honest physics, physics that acknowledges its own limits, cannot tell you what happens to your experience when you die. It can tell you what happens to your atoms. It can tell you what happens to the information in your brain. It can tell you about the structure of spacetime, but it cannot tell you whether there's something it's like to be dead, because it doesn't understand what it's like to be alive. It wasn't one insight. It was the accumulation of many insights, settling slowly into a different way of seeing. I stopped thinking of myself as a thing that exists for a while and then stops existing. I started thinking of myself as a pattern, a process, a region of spacetime, a temporary concentration of information, and experience in a universe that conserves information and extends eternally in time. I stopped thinking of death as annihilation. I started thinking of it as a boundary, the edge of my world line, the place where the pattern of me ends and the patterns of everything else continue. I stopped demanding that my existence be infinite to be meaningful. I started seeing the finite shape of my life as what gives it form. A life without death would be shapeless, endless, perhaps meaningless in a different way. I stopped pretending that physics answers all the questions. I accepted that consciousness is mysterious, that what happens to experience at death is unknown, that this uncertainty is not a failure of science but an honest acknowledgement of the limits of our current understanding. And somewhere in all of this, the fear went away. Not because I convinced myself I would live forever, not because I found evidence for an afterlife, not because I suppressed the thought of death or distracted myself from it. The fear went away because I stopped seeing death as the enemy. I started seeing it as part of the structure, part of what makes a life rather than an endless, formless existence. I want to be careful here. I'm not telling you how to feel about death. I'm not saying you should stop fearing it. Fear is natural. Fear is human. If you fear death, that's okay. I feared it for 63 years. What I'm offering is a perspective, a way of looking at death through the lens of physics that's different from the simple annihilation picture, a way that acknowledges the strange truths about energy conservation and information preservation and the block universe and the mystery of consciousness, a way that doesn't pretend to have answers we don't have, but also doesn't pretend that the crude materialist picture is the only scientific option. Physics tells us that your atoms are eternal. They came from stars and they'll return to stars. Physics tells us that information is conserved. The patterns that describe you don't vanish, they disperse. Physics tells us that space-time is a block, and your life is a permanent feature of that block, not something that gets erased when you reach its edge. Physics tells us that consciousness is a mystery we don't understand, and honest scientists should admit they don't know what happens to experience at death. None of this proves anything about afterlives or survival or continuation. The boundaries between you and the universe, between existence and non-existence, between life and death, are blurrier than we usually assume. You are more continuous with everything else than you usually feel, and the end of your life is more like the edge of a painting than like the destruction of the canvas. I'm 85 years old now. I've lived a long life. I've thought about the deepest questions physics can ask. I've also thought about the questions physics can't answer, and I've made peace with both. When I die, my atoms will continue. My information will disperse into the universe. My world line will remain as a permanent feature of spacetime. And my consciousness, I don't know. Nobody knows. Maybe it ends. Maybe it transforms. Maybe the question doesn't even make sense. What I know is that I'm not afraid anymore. Not because I have certainty, because I have understanding. Understanding that death is not annihilation but transformation. Understanding that my existence is woven into the fabric of the universe, not separate from it. Understanding that the fear of death comes from thinking of yourself as a thing that can be destroyed, when really you're a process, a pattern, a temporary form in an eternal dance. The universe is stranger than we thought, stranger than our intuitions suggest, stranger than our fears assume. And in that strangeness, there's room for something other than terror. There's room for wonder, for acceptance, for peace. I don't know what happens when I die, but I know that whatever happens, I'm not separate from the universe. I never was, and I never will be. That's what physics taught me. Not an answer, a way of seeing. And for me, that was enough. The fear of death is the fear of non-existence, the terror of not being. But physics suggests that the concept of non-existence is more complicated than we usually assume. Energy is conserved, information is preserved, spacetime is eternal, consciousness is mysterious, the boundaries are blurry. You are not a thing that will be destroyed. You are a pattern in the universe, and patterns don't cease to exist when they change. They become part of other patterns. They disperse. They transform. They continue in ways we can't fully track or understand, but continue nonetheless. Maybe that's not immortality, maybe it's not what you hoped for, but maybe it's something, maybe it's enough. I look out my window now at the same view I looked at 22 years ago, when the fear first left me. The trees are different. The light is different. I am different. Everything changes. Everything continues. And I'm not afraid.